Today's guest on a Life and a Living podcast is Jackie Ferguson, who is the Director of Multicultural Programming in Walk West in Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, Jackie was only on the podcast, relatively short period ago, 3 months, in fact. In fact, when I looked it up today in advance of the recording, we recorded the interview with her about diversity and inclusivity on the 10th of February, and we published it in the middle of March. And my God Almighty, how things have changed in that very short period of time. And I asked Jackie to come back on the podcast because I feel so strongly about what has happened over the whole, the George Floyd, you talk about, the Ahmaud Arbery, and other dreadful events, because I feel so strong about it. And I also feel that as a white European, it's very easy for me to kind of say, well, isn't it awful, tut tut, but it's nothing to do with me. And in actual fact, I have got to take responsibility for what I do. So we really do kind of get into the conversation about, what are the things that we should be doing? If we say that we're allies in this cause, what does that mean? What should we be doing? What responsibility do we have? And what action should we be taking? But also talked about, where the change is going to be driven from. Where does Jackie see this change coming from, if change is going to happen in the whole area of this racism? And the need for change and the need for rebalancing. And we also talk about business leaders, how they can actually create an environment in the workplace to ensure that we have multicultural organizations and there is equality right across all of those cultures and races. So it's a very, very troublesome, worrying, frightening time in the world. And I really felt it was my responsibility and certainly my wish to bring the subject up, because it's not the normal sort of conversation that we have on a Life and a Living podcast. But I think it is just fundamentally so important that we have this discussion, because we all have a role to play. So I really want you to listen very intently to what Jackie Ferguson has to say. She does talk about, give a link at the end, and it will be in the show notes, to her website. And there is a ton of fantastic content there, and resources, articles, and recommendations that she makes to really educate ourselves. So really pay attention, and I think you will be fascinated, slightly disturbed in other ways, but also, I hope, encouraged to go and do something about this dreadful situation and this dreadful problem of racism that we are just as a nation, and globally, that we are not addressing and that we're not tackling, and that we keep on pushing down the road as well as pushing it onto the carpet. Hopefully that will change. So thank you, Jackie, for coming along. And listeners, please pay real attention to what is being said here. So Jackie, welcome back.
Thank you, John. It's good to be back.
Not that long since we had our last conversation. And
it was not.
I was just saying to you beforehand that I looked it up. I mean, we published the interview that we did with you on diversity on March the 18th. We recorded it a few weeks before that in February. My God Almighty, how the world has changed in those short weeks. Isn't it incredible?
That's exactly right, John. It is a different world that we're living in now than we were when we recorded.
And and we were talking about the whole issue of diversity and inclusivity. It was so relevant, it was so pertinent, it was the right time. And I really felt, being honest, that we just needed to come back today to do another interview, because I just feel so strong about what has happened in recent times with, the George Floyd and everything else, that, it's, and to a very large extent for me as a white European, it's kind of easy to say, well, isn't it dreadful? Isn't it appalling? I'm horrified by it, but it's got nothing to do with me. Right.
Right.
And yet that can't be. But, when you look at it in terms of what's happened, with, George Floyd and Arbery and Breonna Taylor and such events and more recent ones as well.
Mhm.
But because we all have the potential to be allies, and that's really, I think that's a very large part of your message, is that we need to be allies. But what should we be doing as allies? What's your expectation of it? What can we do? What can people like me do that actually have a love for the United States, just
Yeah.
hate the injustice, and just kind of feel it can't go on any longer?
So, John, on an individual level, I wrote a blog that was recently published by the National Diversity Council on how to be an ally in these times. And there were 6 steps that I talked about. The first one is listen. For allies that don't know where to start, the most meaningful thing that you can do is listen to the voices of those that are often silenced. And even though you might feel empathy for a situation, you can't fully understand those experiences that you don't live. So the best way to learn is to listen. Secondly, educating yourself. You know, it's not the job of Black people to educate white people about racial injustice. So doing the work of seeking out resources to give yourself a cultural baseline to then have meaningful conversations around race with others, that gives you a deeper perspective, deeper insights, and expands your empathy that can lead to action. The next thing that people can do is talk to your kids. They're our hope for a better future. Talk about current events, share your feelings with them of sadness or anger or frustration. Diversify their reading lists, movie lists, and then call out racism and bias when you see it in the media. Don't shy away from difficult conversations with them. They're more mature than people realize, and they're more aware than people realize. And then be an example. And then speak up. Speak up in your family, in your friend groups. Speak up on your social media platforms. Speak up in the voting booth, especially locally and nationally. Participate in protests or demonstrations. Call your legislators. It's important that we recognize that it's not just during the weeks of incident where people are having this conversation. This is my conversation. It's your conversation. Continue to have it. And then the next step is nurturing truth-telling relationships. We need relationships that challenge us, where there's a shared commitment to speak our truths and hear each other all the way through, no matter how uncomfortable. And then giving back is super important. So providing access and opportunity to people who need it, mentor someone in an underserved community, or volunteer, donate, encourage other people to do the same. And that's another way that you can create significant impact on a local scale. But those are some of the steps in being a real ally and being a strong ally in this time.
One of the on the I can't remember which blog post that you had, but you had a list of recommended reading, and
Yes.
one of those was the book White Fragility,
Yes.
which is Robin. I can't remember her surname. Robin.
Angela. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, D'Angelo. Yeah, yeah. And I'm actually reading that book at the moment, and it is interesting. It is challenging, right?
Yes.
As for a white person to read it, because I would come to it saying, I'm not racist and I want to do something and I want to, but when you actually read it, it really does challenge that,
Yes.
we have these biases that are just ingrained into us. And it's almost kind of the uncomfortable recognition that that is true,
Mm-hmm.
because it's actually not a truth you kind of nearly want to admit to.
Right.
And then it's about informing and doing that. But I think your point about educating yourself is just so important, because the danger is that, and I would put my hand up, and I've said it to you before, kind of, yeah, okay, I know this, I know something about it on the surface, but
Right.
even reading something like White Fragility makes me realize, boy, I mean, I thought I was on the surface. I'm barely on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that there's so much more for me to understand. And it is that story of, walking in other people's shoes to actually really understand,
That's
and
right.
truly understand it. And to a large extent, I can't really do that, but I can begin to understand it a bit more by having the conversation. And I think that your point about you know, being brave, is that the right word? But being, you know, being prepared to stand up
Yes.
and engage in a conversation or challenge a conversation that you feel isn't appropriate. Because so much from my perspective, so much of racism is actually not intended.
It's subtle. It's subtle.
And
And
it's subtle, but it's hellishly damaging.
yes.
Right. And we could all kind of dismiss it. Oh, I didn't mean it, or you know, it was a joke, or whatever it might be. But that's just not good enough. And I think it is that responsibility that we have to take it on board. I'm curious, and we touched on before we started, one of the things that you know, and we're seeing it a lot in the, because I've been in Europe, I'm seeing a lot of the British news where a lot of this debate about statues being taken down because of slave traders. And yes, I agree with all of that. My concern with that, Jackie, is that then the conversation and the focus is on taking down historical figures and not actually addressing the issues that exist today.
Mm-hmm.
And that I can tick a box and say, I've done something because, you know, or as a politician, as a leader in the community, we've taken down the statue, but actually I've done nothing to actually change it going forward. I don't know how you feel about when you see the same thing happening in the US. I'm sure you see it in the news happening in different parts of the world.
You know, I think that it's important to remove these statues because of the fact that it's a reminder of the negative past of Black people in the US and in other parts of the world as well. But for us here, you know, it's a negative reminder. And what we want to do is move forward. And although, you know, really what we need to change is legislation and that healthcare disparities and economic disparities and disparities in lending and those things that are systemic inequities. You know, there are small things that we can do to kind of try and level the playing field. And those things matter more to some than others, but it's a visible acknowledgement that something was wrong. And, you know, I'm for it. But I think that it can be distracting to others that focus on, oh, you know, this is historical, rather than saying, this is part of a cry out for the systemic inequities in our society. And, you know, one of the ways that things have remained the status quo is distraction with things like that, or you know, among the many protests that have occurred here in the US, you know, there was some rioting, and some people are distracted by that and saying, oh, you know, they're destroying businesses, but don't distract yourself from the fact that the reason why is because lives were taken, lives that shouldn't have been taken. And so, you know, distraction has certainly been one of the ways that things have remained the same. But I think that people are moving away from that overall and saying, look, these things need to change. So I'm happy and hopeful about some changes that will be coming in the future.
Because I mean, to an extent, it can be very quite. It can become quite despairing in terms of looking at the, you know, the lack of progress. Because, you know, despite what your political administrator said in recent times about the great advancement that had happened occurred for the Black African American, in actual fact, there was an article in The Economist which quoted that, in fact, between, I think it was the mid 60s to around the year 2000, there was a certain amount of progress in things like pay and things like that. But actually, since the year 2000, there's been none. There's been no progress.
That's right.
As a society, how did we get here for that lack of progress to be allowed?
Well, John, we have to start with the American indigenous. So, which interestingly enough, were made U.S. citizens in June of 1932, I believe. So if you think about that, the American indigenous were made U.S. citizens in 1932. You know, it was the start of a narrative of racial difference, which was employed to justify behaviors that would otherwise be unjustifiable. So settlers calling them savages and that was all that was required to mistreat them and kill them and move them off their land. And that same narrative was used to develop Jim Crow laws and slavery and institutionalized inequities in our law enforcement and legal system and healthcare disparities. So, I think that these negative narratives are just created by how people tell the story. And if you can create a justification for treating people different, that's how it starts. And that's not something that we have overcome as a society. And although many people think that they've personally moved past it, there are so many biases that are socialized from, family and the media and friends and things that they hear, that they don't have access to really understand and be connected with people of other cultures. And so they listen to what they're told about these cultures rather than experiencing them for themselves. And that's one of the things that I enjoy doing the most, is these connectivity exercises in my practice that allow people to understand how many ways that they're the same, and then to appreciate and value and honor the ways that they're different.
And I mean, as a diversity and inclusivity expert, I mean, and the work that you do, and we all hope and pray that change will actually come.
Yes.
But where do you think that the change will come from? Where will the drive to change come from, and who needs to be the drivers of it? Because let's be honest, if the politicians have not done, of all shapes and sizes, have not done a particularly good job on this. So where is the change going to come from?
So, I think that it's really a groundswell. I think right now, these young people have a different level of appreciation for diversity and inclusion, and their expectations are different. Mm-hmm. So then it's incumbent upon leaders, whether they're community leaders, business leaders, to do what's necessary to support our society and these young people, because they have different expectations. And I think they're going to be leaders in our new world for a more inclusive society.
And how can, if you take for right now for those business leaders, mm-hmm. We have this kind of extraordinary combination of COVID and everything that's going on with racism and the problems that's emanating from there.
Yeah.
What can employers do to support their employees as they navigate? We were struggling navigating with COVID, and now with everything else that's kind of layered on top of that. What can leaders do to really help their people navigate that?
Yeah. Leaders need to engage diversity practitioners that are equipped to facilitate listening sessions with their HR teams to provide the needed support. Leaders have to check in. This is a heavy weight that we're all carrying with COVID, and now the racial unrest that we're experiencing. It's heavy to carry for all, but most especially people of color, because this is part of the reality of being subject to bias and racism, which has been part of our everyday lives, for as long as we've been here. And I'll give you an example, John. When I go to a mall, for example, if I'm going to a luxury department store, it often takes me, if I'm dressed down as you dress going to the mall in a jeans and a t-shirt or whatever, it takes me often 20 minutes to get helped in those department stores, because what people see is a Black woman, and they make assumptions as to who I am based on that. They don't have, understanding that I, own property and have a positive net worth and, have above an 800 credit score. They see, let me keep an eye on her. She might want to steal something, or she probably can't afford anything in here. And none of that is true. But, it's something that that I'm subject to and I have to think about when I go into a luxury department store, especially, that, oh, I've got jeans on instead of my business suit. So I've got to wait 20 minutes
Yeah.
before
But
someone will help me.
But I mean, that's appalling for starters. But you're a very well educated, very successful person. But and so you can make sense of it in the sense that you can understand it and you can process that in some way, even though you don't like it, obviously, and it's not right. But I'm just thinking, I mean, for an 18, 19, 20-year-old girl going into the same store,
Yeah.
how do they make sense of it and not become bitter, angry, and feel very, disturbed by that?
So, my daughter is 18,
Yeah.
and, it's a different feeling for me having experienced this. I could spend the entire of your day, John, going through examples that I've had over my life, but it's different when it's your kid. And,
Absolutely.
it's appalling to her. It is something that I have to talk her through and make sure that her self-esteem is not affected by the fact that, she the same thing occurs for her. And more so, I think, when you're younger too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, she was raised, in a multicultural, multi-generational family. And, she's now beginning to see the world for what it is, and, the beauty of it and the ugliness.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can't continue to shield her from that as she enters into adulthood. But it's hard and it's very frustrating for her. So what I do as a parent is just make sure that I talk her through it and that her self-esteem is not affected by it.
And can she, make sense is probably the wrong word, but can she process it without it making her bitter?
That's a great question, John. And, she's angry about the state of the world, and these injustices that she doesn't understand and doesn't want to understand, and good for her. And she's certainly been protesting and doing things, in support of racial justice, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But she's, certainly been listening to my work over the past years, and then with a multiracial family. I think she's more understanding and is able to process it better than some.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
It is hard because I mean, as you know, I've got daughters.
Yes.
I've never had to have that conversation with
right.
I just haven't.
That's
And
right.
and I I think when I think about it, I think I would struggle to have that conversation and try and make sense of it without them becoming bitter. I just think that's that's a huge issue. But going back to the business leaders,
Yeah.
I mean, the business leaders have a responsibility to create cultures where, kind of multiracial can thrive equally.
Yeah.
What are the things they need to do?
So the first thing, John, I would say is recognize your privilege and use it for good. So people think privilege is a dirty word. And, you often hear it's not privilege. I worked hard for what I have. But privilege isn't necessarily about what you've accomplished as much as it is about the perception to others about who you are and what you're capable of. And again, I'll say who you are and what you're capable of. And that can be good or bad. I recently did a virtual privilege walk, and I think it may have been the largest virtual privilege walk on record with the North Carolina Chamber, with almost 300 participants. And it was such an amazing experience, not only for the people that participated, but for me, just with the opportunity for people to understand privilege and be vulnerable with it, and then understand how to be empowered with it. Because you can provide access and opportunity for people. It's not it's not negative. It's not something to feel guilty about. It's something to understand and leverage for good. And then, businesses have to amp up their diversity and inclusion programs. A lot of companies, their PR person shared this amazing anti-racism statement last week, but now what? It's the same as recognizing the LGBTQIA plus community only during the 30 days of June. So, you have your pride colors in your branding for 30 days, but are your HR policies inclusive for them all 12 months of the year? And companies make this statement against racism, but are you ensuring that your organization has a no tolerance policy for bias? Are you training your staff in unconscious bias, in inclusive language? Do they see they see the leaders challenging bias statements and microaggressions? Something that often people hear is, I don't know if this person is up for the challenge of this project, but say, why do you think that? Is it because, well, she's got kids at home, or he, I don't know if he's qualified. Challenge those statements that you hear. Don't just, brush them off and let them go. And, the fact is, John, when you and I walk into a room, no matter what the topic, the perception of a lot of people is that you're more qualified. And I have to work to earn the confidence that you're simply granted at the door. And unfortunately, that's just the way it is. So as business leaders, you've got to work against the bias and the stereotypes that exist and, naturally among people, and then naturally in cultures. And you do that through education. You do that through challenging others.
And are you seeing a shift in business leaders? Are you seeing a shift in taking it seriously? Because I think, I think that for many business leaders before all of this, they would have seen diversity and inclusivity. Oh yes, we must do that. It's a HR issue, right? And we place it in the HR department, and we look to the HR director, kind of say, well, yes, we have somebody who's dealing with it. And my view, actually, that's not where it should be. Nothing against HR, but that's not where it should be. But are you really, do you really see them actually taking it seriously?
Yeah, definitely many companies are finding themselves unprepared in this moment with messaging and support for their employees. You certainly cannot just nominate your culturally diverse employee or your HR person to do the job. There's significant training involved to be able to create the programs necessary for a successful diversity and inclusion program. And this person also needs to be tightly aligned with leadership, and leadership has to be committed to this and weave it throughout the entire DNA of their organization. It's so important that it be tied to recruiting practices and the strategic plan and performance reviews, because that's when your organization knows that you take it seriously, and then they're measured on it. And measurement is one of the most important parts of diversity and inclusion. And then leaders also need to find people that they can have difficult conversations with so that they can understand better. It's sometimes really lonely at the top, as you know, and I know that's something that you help leaders work through in your practice. But if they focus on self-education and leading by example, their employees will give them space to learn and grow. D&I is a journey. It's not something that you can, just check off a box, or you've completed a training, so now you're good. It's a continually evolving practice in any organization.
So if I kind of come back to where we start and saying, okay, it's all very well for somebody like me who's a white European sitting here saying, tut, isn't it awful? But the work that I do as an executive coach with teams and with senior executives, what should I be doing? Because I said to you, I put my hand up and say, in the team programs that I've run to date, I have not had any element about diversity and inclusivity. And I'm kind of embarrassed to admit the fact that I haven't, right? But that's the truth. I haven't. What should, people in positions like mine, what should we be doing to make sure that we're driving this message home?
Yeah. Successful diversity and inclusion programs start from the top. They're championed from the top. They have to be trained from the top as to the benefits, understanding change management, which I know you do work
Mm.
through in your business, because it's a big change. D&I challenges how people think, and it challenges their innate responses. So it's work for every individual to educate themselves and to be self-aware in the space. And then, people will fight any type of change, and leaders have to be prepared to answer the what's in it for me over and over and over. And, a lot of times people think D&I is only beneficial to people that are culturally diverse, but it's not true, because the more you have the best people in place, and not just the people in your in-group, to do this work in every level of your organization, the more you have innovation and creativity in your organization, the more opportunity you have for different ways to solve problems. The recruiting, the retention is improved. And then overall, you're going to make more money. And making more money means for everyone opportunity for raises, promotions, better benefits, new lines of business that they need leaders for. And so one of the ways that I like to describe it is, people think there's a limited opportunity, and, I describe it with like putting a few peas on a plate, but it's not limited opportunity. There's unlimited opportunity when businesses can make more money and create more lines of business. And so it's like unlimited opportunity in that organization or another. And then, but the D&I programs have to be tied into the DNA of the business and the strategic plans, performance metrics, and recruiting and marketing, because you want to make sure that, here comes Generation Z into the marketplace and the workplace. And, the things that matter to them are different. They care about what your causes are. They're not the same with regard to being tied to brands. They like brands that have causes that they align with. And then same with sales. D&I is important in understanding how to sell better, because the world is changing. Society is becoming more diverse. And who you walk into that sales meeting with may not look the same as you, might not think the same as you. And you've got to be open and culturally competent to have those conversations, because you offend someone and you're not getting that sale.
Yeah. So it goes back to education, doesn't it? And we all have the responsibility to actually find a way to get to be educated, and that's our personal responsibility. Are you optimistic about change?
I try to stay optimistic, John. I think that we're seeing a shift now because of everything that's occurring. So I think that COVID-19 forced us to slow down and be present in the moment. Whereas in the past, we've seen these egregious things occur in our society, but, we've got to pick up the kids, and we've got dinner with, people at work, and we get busy. But having had to slow down, I think is making us more aware. And I think people are exploring ideas of privilege and ideas of racial inequity more than they ever have. And I think that people are beginning to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, and having those conversations and reading those books that they never picked up before, and really trying to understand what they're missing and what they've not paid attention to. So I am optimistic that we can start making real changes in our society based on, everyone coming together to say, this is not okay. It takes all of us. It's not just one group's problem. This is our problem as a society, and we have to fix it together.
Jackie, you got a great message. I really admire and respect the work that you're doing. You know that. I'm a big fan of what you're doing. Where can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can go to thediversitymovement.com, and you'll find a lot of resources there, opportunities to learn, and information that'll help you, and you can get in touch with me there as well.
Great. Well, I encourage everyone to do that because, yes, I've been on the site, and yes, there's an amazing amount of content that is just wonderful content. Thank you so much for coming back on. I just felt it was really important to have this conversation, and I wanted to share this with my audience. So, Jackie, thank you so much indeed. It's been an honor to have you here again.
John, thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All righty.